Good morning. It's a great honor to be able to speak to you. What I want to tell you is that the people I'm going to talk about today are all, without exception, okay. The people I'm going to talk to you about today are all, without exception, equal opportunity offenders. They wrote a manuscript that became the most outrageous text of the 18th century, in a century that excelled at writing outrageous texts. And the Three Imposters, this is why I say they're equal opportunity offenders: Jesus, Moses, and Mohammed. I give the 18th century spelling of Mohammed. Now, it was widely said in Christian Europe that somewhere, somebody had said this once, and that it got repeated as a kind of folklore almost. Now, obviously, Mohammed was always the first candidate. That was a slur that was issued against Islam for centuries by Christians and Jews. And of course, Jews called Jesus an impostor, and you can imagine what Christians called Jews. This is not a world where religious toleration is even a value. The first candidate for having said this was no other than the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II, who was accused by the Pope in 1239 of having said that the Pope himself is a scorpion spitting out poison from the stinger of his tail. Sorry, that the emperor is a scorpion spitting out poison from the stinger of its tail. It stated that the whole world has been fooled by three impostors: Jesus Christ, Moses, and Mohammed. Frederick responded to this accusation that he had said this by calling the Pope a heretic. Various philosophers were accused of having said this, and Martin Luther translated a Hebrew work into German, which discussed the life of Jesus and was meant actually to show that Jews were conniving. Maimonides was also said to expound on the theme of imposture and used Jesus as his example, and of course, Mohammed. So there was all manner of people who thought nothing better than accusing one of the other founders of the great religions of the book. So the reality is that, as far as we can tell, no one had actually written about saying this or written about the three great founders in a way that was intended to be a slur. So why in the very early 18th century did a group of people, whom we'll identify in a moment, choose to put out a manuscript that identified the three impostors and went on to explain why they were impostors, and went on to quote from segments of manuscripts by Spinoza and Hobbes and so forth? These people have to be understood, I think, within the terms of what we call the crisis of the European mind. It was a French historian, Paul Hazard, who first identified this crisis, which begins in the 1680s and resolves itself in the 1720s. The single most important event in precipitating this crisis was the revocation of the Edict of Nantes by the French king in 1685. The edict had given a degree of religious toleration to French Protestants, and beginning actually even before the official revocation, as early as 1683, French Protestants began to leave. And this was no easy thing, because you did not get permission to leave. You either had to flee, leaving behind possessions and sometimes even children, and go to one of the Protestant areas of Europe where you would be free. The obvious place was the Dutch Republic. England, of course, the city of Geneva. Some refugees went to Berlin, where the German king was eager to get their talent, particularly in watchmaking. And so we reckon that about 200,000 French Huguenots left France. In Amsterdam, by the late 1680s, there were whole sections of the city that were French-speaking, where French food was served, where one lived, as it were, as if one were in France. The other thing that precipitates this crisis, and it is a crisis essentially in the Protestant mind, and that is the appearance of the danger of a Catholic becoming King of England, and that's exactly what happens in 1688. So suddenly, the gains that European Protestants have made in the previous 100 years look as if they're going to be torn away. The revolution of 1688-89, the so-called Glorious Revolution, is the result of the way in which English Protestants responded to the challenge. And also, within a year or two of the revolution, you have the outbreak of international war, the War of Spanish Succession. Louis XIV had attempted to put one of his relatives on the throne of Spain, and that's what precipitated this war. The war is very important for exacerbating this crisis, but also because the Low Countries were specifically threatened. So all those refugees that went up to the Dutch Republic were now endangered if the French army was able to make its way significantly north. So what you're beginning to see in this period is this growing sense of dread, of possible extinction of Protestantism. Some people thought that that could actually happen. And we're beginning to see in international circles, in the Republic of Letters, what's called at the time, a hint that many of the people who have been forced to flee or who are devout Protestants and watching what's happening in Europe, beginning to become disillusioned, not just with the French king and with Catholicism in general, but with religion itself. So within this Protestant diaspora, and one of the most important things about it is that a number of these people were highly literate. They took their skills with them, and of course you have this explosion of French language journals beginning in roughly 1690, many of them being produced in the Dutch Republic. This, by the way, is a time when 50% of the books in Europe are produced in the Dutch Republic. So being there meant that one also had contact with a world of printers and booksellers and an international commerce in books that made it an attractive place to be if you wanted to get a book out into the world. The other thing that's happening in England in this period is the collapse of pre-publication censorship. And you think, well, how can you pre-publication censor a book? Well, you could, and that stops in 1685. There was no censorship, in particular in the Dutch Republic, against French language texts. If the texts were in Dutch, that was a different matter. Now, I want to take you to the manuscripts of John Toland. Toland is a famous character in his time. Throughout the 18th century, he was well known as a free thinker. He's the person who brought the word pantheist into the English language, and he's also working as a spy for the British government, and largely doing that in the Dutch Republic. He was a Whig, which meant that he belonged to the political party that supported the revolution of 1688-89, and also supported the war against Louis XIV. So he was a man with a mission. And we know that he lived in The Hague for roughly 2 years, from 1708 to 1710. And in his manuscripts, and I put the manuscript up only to seek your pity. See, actually what happened here was that a chicken walked into the archives and it was escaping a DNA test. And what we have here is the meeting record of the Knights of Jubilation in November of 1710. And this is a record, first of what they ate, then what they drank, and predictably the manuscript deteriorates. As it goes along, it's harder and harder to read. And indeed, what's important about, well, there are a number of things that are important about it. Let me just point out the manuscript talks about the joyous constitutions of this order of the Knights of Jubilation, using the French word constitutions in a way that it is not used at that time, meaning statutes or regulations. And that's an importation of the British term constitutions into French. And it's important because that language is Masonic language, and we could go on at some length as to why I identified this manuscript as a proto-Masonic text, but I won't bore you with the kind of academic quarrels that historians get themselves up to. The important thing about this text is it's signed. And so we have a list of Monsieur Baume, Gleditch, Charles Livier, Bernard Picard, the famous engraver of the period, not famous when he signed this, but to become famous, Monsieur Debay, and Prosper Marchand. Marchand is the secretary to the order, and indeed, he is the one whose handwriting is deteriorating as he takes a note of what's being said and what's being done at this meeting. Without these signatures, we would never have been able to figure out what is going on here. Marchand left his manuscripts to the University Library in Leiden. He left over 60,000 folio copies of various things, a huge correspondence, and in the 1970s, we were beginning to get a sense of what was in that correspondence. We find a letter of 1737, where Fritsch, who was identified as the Grand Master of the order, is reminiscing, writing to Marchand. Fritsch is back in Germany, he's a book dealer in Frankfurt, and he's discussing with them, remember how Charles Livier got a manuscript in 1711 from the library of Benjamin Furley. And Benjamin Furley was an important English refugee living in Rotterdam. He was a refugee because his father had been a regicide. He had signed the death warrant of Charles I, and wisely, at the restoration of monarchy, got out of the country and went to Rotterdam. That's why the Furley family can be found there. And Furley was a collector of books and manuscripts. He had a deep, abiding interest in literature, and he was a Quaker. By the way, there are letters of his here at the Library Company where he writes to William Penn about their common belief in the doctrine of metempsychosis. That is the belief that the soul migrates after the body dies. So Furley was interested intellectually in all kinds of things, but he also was something of a heretic in matters religious. Charles Livier went into Furley's library, and Furley's library, by the way, was a place where John Locke spent time, where Toland spent time, where just about anybody who was anybody coming into Rotterdam would go pay a visit to Furley. And there Livier found a manuscript. We don't know what it was about exactly. We have no real idea. What we do know is that Livier and another man who was a close friend of Marchand, a man called Jean Rousset de Missy, touched up the text in ways that we will never know exactly how it got touched up. The text was originally called The Spirit of Spinoza, and they first published it, Baume and Livier, first published it in 1719 under the title Le Vie et l'Esprit de Spinoza. There, by the way, only 4 copies in the whole world. One of them is at UCLA. Why are there only 4 copies? Because the authorities confiscated everything they could get their hands on, and when Livier died, he had asked his widow to make sure to destroy what copies there were. So a print run of about 200 or 300 books disappeared into 4. And then 2 years later, the same group brought out the book with the new title, and that's the title by which it's known universally, the Treatise on the Three Imposters. Well, what did this book say? Ignorance is the only source of the false ideas which men have of the divinity, the soul, spirits, religion. Right reason is the only light which people should follow. The fear which made the gods also made religion. That sentiment, by the way, comes directly out of Hobbes. where he talks about the origins of religion. It isn't exactly human fear that leads to the impulse to be religious. The founders of religion, well, the priests put them forward as prophets, diviners. Asia has seen three born who distinguished themselves by their laws and cults. Moses was the most ancient, Jesus Christ came after him, and Muhammad appeared last. So what we're seeing here is an attempt to construct an argument as to how it is that these three imposters gained the kind of credibility that they did. Of course, the only way to really explain this is to say that as the number of fools is infinite, Jesus Christ found subjects everywhere. One can judge from all that we have said that Christianity, like other religions, is no more than a crudely woven imposture. Like I said, these are equal opportunity offenders. And then the readers addressed directly. This reader is the most remarkable of what might be said touching the three celebrated legislators whose religions have subjugated a great part of the universe. To cure yourself of the errors which they have used, have blinded you, read what follows with a free and disinterested spirit. That will be the way to discover the truth, God as we have seen being but nature, or if one wishes, the assemblage of all beings. That is pantheism, and that is Spinoza. So what we have here, what's gone into making this text, and it's about 60 pages in print. What you have is clearly, I've often thought that it's a group that wrote this thing. It was a lot of fun, drinking and eating and writing this text. And you pull bits and pieces from Spinoza, whole paragraphs directly taken from Spinoza, and also Hobbes, and your general reading, as well as the new, was contemporary to this group, the new biblical criticism. Richard Simon is the most famous exemplar of it, that historicized the Bible. The first time the Bible is taken as an historical document rather than as simply the Word of God. The combination, the melange of Hobbes, Spinoza, the new biblical criticism, and the anger, because a number of these people who are involved in the Nights of Jubilation are French Huguenot refugees, thrown out of France, angry at what has happened to them, in some cases frantically worried about relatives, etc., who have been left behind. This mélange of Hobbes and Spinoza and biblical criticism gives us the treatise on the three imposters. It's a text that has been in print ever since 1721. It was picked up then again by the most important Dutch publisher of the mid-18th century, Marc-Michel Rey, who published Rousseau, Voltaire, many of the great philosophes. He did an edition of the traité. It then gets repeated, it gets translated into English and German, etc. And as late as the 1960s, it was possible to read that Jesus, Moses, and Mohammed had been the three great imposters. Thank you.
Annette Gordon-Reed, I'm from Harvard. This is fascinating because, as I'm sure you know, Jefferson wrote his own Bible, taking out all the miracles and so forth, but he said that it was other people who created Jesus as a divine being, not that Jesus himself had any kind of will to deceive people. The three imposters, does that imply, does the text suggest that these people are doing this knowingly? They have an intent to deceive people? Jefferson may be letting Jesus off the hook by saying he never claimed all these kinds of things. It was other people who suggested them. So they are imposters by intent?
Yes, absolutely. Now, why are they doing this? And what I didn't go into is that there's a whole political subtext going on here, that all of them in their impostures were attempting to create their own political power. And that, for instance, Jesus is described as a subverter of republics. So what we have here are people who are deeply influenced by the political events of the time. In some cases, their own lives have been disrupted. And they are convinced that this impulse toward absolutism, which is what has possessed the French king and the Spanish king and various other kings, of course, this impulse is deeply against all the things that should be good in the world. And let's get back to the source of it. The source is Jesus, Moses, and Mohammed. In fact, Jesus is described as a subverter of republics. Interestingly enough, Marchand, in his private papers, put this book in one category. He had a whole complex set of arrangements for his. This is before the card catalog. These are all people trying to figure out where to put this. And he put it with one other book, the Vindice contra Tyrannos, the Vindication Against Tyranny, which is a late 16th century manuscript book that attacked royal absolutism and argued that the good Protestant has the obligation to revolt against tyranny.
Okay, Conrad.
Conrad Harper, New York City. Thank you for that enlightening discussion. Let me ask you about present-day resonance. You brought us to the 1960s, but what would you say today of the three imposters as dealt with in the text?
I didn't quite get that. You mean what?
What materiality should we take from that discussion historically for today? What resonance has it now?
Well, if you were to say some of the things I just said in certain countries, you might have a fatwa against you. Or you might go to your local bishop and complain bitterly, and you might have you might be excommunicated if you are a Catholic. The point here is that this is meant to be offensive, and it is meant to make us come up short and say, well, what is the point of religion? Why should we believe any of this? That's, I think, the message for today, but it's not a message that is received graciously in a lot of quarters.
I'm going to exercise prerogative of the podium here and ask a question based on your answer there. So, I'm rather often asked by European journalists or European friends, how do you explain, for instance, the constant fight over abortion in the U.S. as opposed to Europe? And what I've been saying is, in my ignorance, and this is presumptuous, is that I think Europeans, it's in their DNA to be somewhat skeptical of religiosity. They've learned to overcome it to some degree, and that lesson never took in this country, and we're suffused with the kind of religiosity that is creating our social policy and politics today. Is that a dopey thing to say, or close to the truth?
Now, would I ever say that was a dopey thing to say? Never. No, I think one of the realities historically is that European free thought, which was virulent in the 18th century and continues as a subtext throughout European thought, never made the same impact in the American colonies and then in the new republic. I think Jefferson is a very good example. I mean, almost all of these founding fathers were deists of some sort. It's a myth to think that they're believing Christians. But what is not present in someone like Benjamin Franklin, although Franklin has tendencies that way, it's certainly not in Jefferson, that is this virulent hatred of religion. You know, Jefferson, what is he going to do? He takes the Bible and he rewrites it. Why not? And clean it up, make it more readable, make it more accessible, take out all the mysterious bits. And what you have is a perfectly serviceable, natural religion. But it doesn't have the bite that a text like this has. And I think one reason also is the enormous monopoly that the clergy had in every European country. There were, for various reasons, we tried to some degree in this country to curtail the clergy and to give them a separate sphere, as it were. Whereas in France, for instance, in the 18th century, the clergy they were not subject to civil authority.
So we never learned the hard lessons that they had to learn in Europe. So, okay.
I'm Mark Thompson, New York. Could you talk just a little bit more about the early reception of the Traité, how whether it was essentially read by very small numbers of intellectuals in different European countries or spread more widely, whether there were rebuttals, whether it became a political controversy, whether there was an attempt to identify and maybe even punish the authors?
Yes, I think it's significant that the widow of Charles Levier insisted that she would burn, as her husband wished, the copies that remained of the book. Even in the Dutch Republic, you would have gotten in deep trouble for circulating a text like this. There was nowhere in Europe where saying these kinds of things would have gotten you anywhere else except prison. So you have to keep that very firmly in mind. However, that being said, there is not a major library in this country or Europe that does not have a copy of it. In other words, it made its way around. Voltaire, when he first read it, was horrified. And he said, if God did not exist, we would have to invent him. That's where that phrase comes from. When he read the Traité, he said, this is dangerous. If people don't believe in God, they'll just believe in themselves. So was there a literature against it? There was to some extent, but it was so clandestine a text that it wasn't ever published by somebody you could identify until the 19th century. Then all sorts of people published it. By then, it wasn't worth getting into a polemic about it. But I can assure you that having this in your library, or if you were a bookseller, having it in your shop, would get you in a great deal of trouble. There was nothing more outrageous than saying what this text said.
Frank.
Frank Stewart, New York. There's a substantial medieval tradition in the West of scurrilous attacks on Muhammad. Are there any signs of that, those attacks of that kind influencing this work?
Oh, yes, I think they must have. I'm not sure that anyone has traced it exactly as to say, well, what was said about Muhammad was said by X or Y previously. But there's a vast literature attacking Muhammad for being everything and anything. An impostor was perhaps among the better things that might have been said about him. And ironically, here you have an example of something being used against, in this case, Islam, then being extrapolated to cover everybody, to cover both Christians and Jews as well as Mohammedans. So it pays to think about what you're doing when you attack another religion, because it could come back to bite you.